Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Old Vine Conference 2024. I'm Sarah Abbott, a co-founder of the conference. Some housekeeping before we commence. This is the second day of the conference. Sessions from today and yesterday have been recorded and will be recorded, and they will be uploaded next week onto our oldvines.org website, from where you can click through to the YouTube channel. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. It's the box with the question mark in, to put any questions to the panel. I or the session moderator will select questions to put to the panel at the end of each session. We usually get a lot of questions, so we try to pick out questions that are really selective of the kind of the most prominent levels of interest and angles of questions. If time allows, the moderator may invite you to ask your question directly. The full program for today and tomorrow is at our website, oldvines.org. You can read the full biographies of our incredible speakers at that website, and you can also, from the website, click on the links to their organizations and projects. We will upload the speaker PowerPoints and presentations onto our website at Old Vines, subject to having that approval from the speaker. Sometimes the speaker needs to keep some information more confidential, but generally, yes, there will be presentations available for you to download. As a registrant to the conference, you will receive a follow-up email from us next week with a recap of all of this and links to all these resources. Well, I just wanted to say how honoured I am to be with you today at the second day of the Old Vine Conference. We had a brilliant first day yesterday. For those of you who were not able to join us yesterday, I'm just going to do a quick recap. So we considered the role yesterday of old vines in the sustainable future of wine. We heard from experts in wine business how it's possible to achieve economic sustainability with old vines, despite very real challenges. We also learned about the role of old vines in preventing genetic erosion and building resilience through biodiversity. We had a brilliant panel with the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation, and what really came out of yesterday was how old vines sit at a nexus of so many of the most critical and inspiring aspects of wine culture, wine growing, making, and marketing. And rather than being something that's from our past, they're really embedded in the sustainability of our future. I should say that perhaps one of the highlights of yesterday was when we heard from the Lodi Grape Growers and Wine Commission, their success in training dogs to sniff out viruses and viral vectors. And this was one of the, I should say the dogs actually have surpassed laboratory accuracy. And I think we can all agree that these are very good dogs. We also made an historic announcement yesterday that the 2025 Old Vine Conference will be held in person in California from the 31st of October to the 4th of November. This is with our partners, ZAP, Zinfandel Advocates and Producers, and with the generous support of the California Wine Institute, the Lodi Wine and Grape Growers Commission, and the Historic Vineyard Society. More information on our website, oldvines.org. We have another packed program today as we consider the role of old vines in the wine industry adaptation to climate change. So I'm delighted to introduce our first session, Planting for the Future. Our expert speaker for this session is Louisa Rose. So Louisa is one of Australia's most acclaimed winemakers. Hello, Louisa. I'm just going to introduce you just in case some people are not aware of how incredibly accomplished you are. But Louisa Rose is one of Australia's most acclaimed winemakers and viticulturists. Her current position is Head of Sustainability at Yalumba Winery, a role she took on 1 year ago, roughly, after earning a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Melbourne University and later graduating from Roseworthy campus at the University of Adelaide. Louisa began her journey with Yalumba in 1992. has since become an instrumental figure in the Australian wine industry, not only in winemaking, but also in viticulture. And she's a leader and a visionary voice in sustainability practices. Over the years, Louisa has earned many accolades, including the Gourmet Traveller Wine Magazine Winemaker of the Year and Winemaker of the Year by the Australian Society of Viticulture and Enology. Her passion for sustainability, research, and I would say a very holistic, connected view of the role of wine in our society makes her a vital voice on how climate change and environmental shifts are shaping viticulture today. Louisa, thank you so much for joining us. So I've got basically lots of questions to ask you. I should say to our audience, those who are joining us in the webinar, please do use the Q&A if there are any follow-up questions or aspects you'd like to put to Louisa. But really, we're going to conduct this through as like a fireside chat. So Yalumba Nursery has been working on propagating the old vines of the future. Could you explain the significance of this project, particularly in the face of climate change, and what the long-term vision looks like for future old vines?
Yeah, hi Belinda. Thank you. Sorry, Sarah.
No worries.
But it is 5 a.m. here in New York, where I am at the moment. So, but it's fantastic to be here. Yeah, our nursery at Yalumba has been nearly 50 years now. Actually, we'll probably celebrate 50 years next year of having it there. And primarily, it's a nursery for grafting vinifera varieties onto resistant rootstocks. We are in South Australia, of course, and we don't have phylloxera. So sometimes people say, why do you graft, onto rootstocks? But it's a really important part of our business and also our commercial entity, which is the nursery, because there's so many other reasons to want to have clean, healthy vines, propagated onto rootstocks. For us in South Australia, a lot of that is about drought tolerance. But there's also lots of other reasons why you want rootstocks, such as salt tolerance, nematodes, or can be issues. We know when you plant onto rootstocks that you often get faster establishment and more consistent yields. So it's about optimizing site and optimizing quality and optimizing your commercial realities too, of course.
Fantastic. And could you elaborate on the importance of clean clones in Yalumba's management strategy and how these contribute to the sustainability and resilience of the vineyard?
Sure. So, clean clones, we're obviously talking about, all the pests and diseases, but mainly in a nursery situation, it's about virus status. And we do have a lot of, old vineyards that have, a significant amount of, of viruses in them. And some of those viruses, the old vineyards live with quite happily. And I know as with my winemaking hat on, I've often talked about particular varieties that that we like. We almost like having some viruses in them because they help to devigorate and and produce good quality. But ultimately, really from a future point of view, going into climate change where we really don't know how some of those other pests and diseases are going to react in different climatic conditions, giving them the best shot by putting them onto rootstocks and making sure that they have a very low virus load as we plant them is really very, very important. And when you manage vineyards, properly, according to the variety, according to your site, then you get a really great result from clean clones as well. And there's other ways to get the balance of those vines right to produce the best wines. So cleanliness is really important. And I think it's really important for long term. If we're really planting for the future and we're planting the future's old vines now, then virus clean health, clean clones can only be the best decision.
Yes, this is a really interesting thread that we heard from their team at Catena, where they have a project in association with their research institute, their Catena Institute, called 1001 Malbecs, where they're working with a lot of old vines, massal selection, to increase the biodiversity, the intra-varietal diversity. And they found, just as you alluded to there, that sometimes you get a kind of a happy accident where there is a sort of, in a way, occasionally, although there is a viral load on a particular clone biotype, actually the growers have kind of adapted to it, often because of this devigorating status. And what they're working on as well is actually, because they want as many different biotypes, they want as much diversity as possible. So they're in this kind of interesting ambivalence sometimes with the viral status, because actually it's useful for them to see what the range of the genetics are. But overall, they're looking, as you say, to develop a clean, healthy, virus-free or low viral load population, even though there are these kind of accidents from the past. It's kind of like an interesting, it's like, and sometimes it can be an unforeseen, you know, aspect of helpfulness. But yes, it's interesting. That's really emerged from our discussions yesterday as well. But for
Yeah,
you,
Sarah, I might. So just,
yeah,
I mean, I absolutely agree that diversity is, is one of the most powerful things that we have, when we're talking about, varieties. And we've done, one of the other things that our nursery does, we've done some clonal selections, well, not, I should say, selections from some of the, the very, very old vines around the Barossa, and sort of created, new selections that we can now, create new vines from. As well as doing a lot of work in, with our research institute, the Australian Wine Research Institute, in having a look at the clone, the differentiation of the clones, using their metagenomics science now, which is amazing to be able to sort of do a family tree of the clones that you have, in your area. It's amazing. I mean, it is. It makes you feel like a proud sort of mother sometimes, looking at this amazing sort of genetic tree. So I think diversity is really, really important. And you can also, within a particular vineyard, it's not only the clones of the variety itself, but using different rootstocks, you can get more diversity within your vineyard as well, particularly when you're looking at things like ripening times, and potentially yields and some of those things that you can help manage a vineyard. And particularly with one of the things about climate change that in Australia we're seeing is that there's going to be, we think, a lot more compression of vintages, potentially warmer time, and not needing to, if everything was the same, your sites would be ripening much more closely together, which is not an ideal situation for a winery. And so using rootstocks and clones are ways of spreading out that ripening and that management of your vineyard. So I couldn't agree more about diversity.
yeah. And so it's this, what's really interesting to me is I keep discovering all the time through this old vine lens different aspects of diversity, and then this very nuanced way in which it gives different aspects of resilience. You mentioned metagenomics. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what that is and how it helps in promoting this intra-varietal diversity?
Yes, well, I am not a geneticist, but it is this amazing way, and it involves it's one of the sciences that sort of come out of our ability to be able to manipulate huge amounts of data, in terms of being able to find now on a DNA level the differences between clones. So for a long time, we had, relatively long time, we were able to differentiate varieties, by analysing their DNA. And now, with the much more powerful number crunching that we have, we're able to assess much more of the genomes and be able to tell those differences between the clones. So you can tell, not only you can differentiate and say, I've got, Chardonnay Bernard clone 95 here and 96 here. But you can also see, trace back through their DNA. Literally, it's just like that DNA family tree of of which one might have come from where. And so it's being able to, it's also being able to sort of, help us with that sort of history of where they might have come from, and how they've adapted. And I think, one of the things that's always fascinated me, is that concept of epigenetics as well, and how, in a long time, over a long time, perhaps vines are also somehow or other adapting, their genetics to their place. Yeah. We did a trial, not a trial, but those clonal selections or selections that I mentioned before of our old vineyards, right around the Barossa. We've got two quite distinct areas within the Barossa. We've got our Barossa Valley, which is the lower, warmer, more fertile, generally still very diverse region. And then we've got that Eden Valley, which is higher in altitude, much less fertile soils, mostly shallower soils. And what we found when we took those selections from those beautiful old vineyards, propagated them up into young vines, put them into one replicated vineyard in the Barossa Valley, that the selections that had come out of the Eden Valley still had quite Eden Valley characteristics, which are, more of those perfumes and, the cooler climate characteristics. And, and we're sort of really fascinated by that, to sort of wondering whether, well, were those vineyards always like that? Or were they, in fact, have they somehow adapted and expressing those characteristics that's come from the climate they were in? Really interesting work, and they're the sort of questions that hopefully metagenomics is going to be able to help us answer as we get, we get more and more of those varieties, that we can have a look at, and that we can then, even if we don't know what the clone is, of course, because those old vine vineyards we won't, but we will be able to compare them all together and go, yeah. That person must have hopped over the fence and pinched yes. the cuttings from their neighbour. Or
yes. We had, in a previous edition of the Old Vine Conference, a speaker who I'm sure you will know of, Dr. Dylan Grigg, who has done a lot of initial research into epigenetics and this DNA methylation that results in adaptations, some adaptations actually being passed on to the offspring of the original adapted vine. And I think it's fair to say that this is a large part of why, people like Dylan and also yourself have this interest in these older vineyards, because there's a kind of adaptation, if you like, if you're anthropomorphizing it, a bit of a wisdom they've kind of acquired, which actually we don't have to lose. So I think that, as you say, that's a fascinating area of study, and I think there's a lot of more research that's being put into that area. It also works on humans. It also goes for humans, actually. We also adapt epigenetically, which I find very fascinating as well. But so I know that you've done a lot of work on drought-tolerant rootstocks. Given we know that with climate change, we have this unpredictability of weather events, and certainly in Australia, you're having to deal with both drought situations, and then sometimes almost in other parts of the world we have the converse. Could you tell us a bit more about the research you're conducting to make site-specific selections for drought-tolerant rootstocks?
Yeah, sure. So one thing about rootstocks that you must remember, and I think it's the same with any vines, whether they're on their own roots or not, but to to the conditions that you have, but also to the rootstock that you have. So we know that, and we set up a trial in the early 2000s, in fact, with some rootstocks in our Riverland vineyard, which is irrigated with Murray River water. And we'd set up this thing, and then lo and behold, and I hope it wasn't causal, but then we had one of our most significant droughts ever, when our water was very much restricted, over a number of years, and that was really perfect for us to really sort of prove this, how different some of the rootstocks were, and so it gave us the ability to see that some rootstocks, in fact, we were probably, historically maybe even using too much water on them for the amount of wine quality that we wanted, and for particular rootstocks, we could cut them back by almost half of what we were using, and still get significantly healthy crops, vines that made it through, that they ripened their grapes really properly as well. So that drought tolerance of certain rootstocks is incredibly important. I think it's also really important to note, and it's really interesting looking at the fashions of particular rootstocks over time, because they are absolutely fashionable. You see their trends that are going, and there's a rootstock that we use a lot of in Australia, or we have used a lot of in Australia, particularly, called Ramsay. And a lot of winemakers, have a fairly poor opinion of Ramsay, because if you do give it a lot of water, or if it's planted somewhere where it has a significant amount of natural water, then it will be very vigorous, and it will probably be over vigorous, and produce, arguably, too high crops that never really ripen, with the right balance. And yet what we found was that it's one of the most drought tolerant rootstocks that we have. So in dry conditions, it performs, much better than some of the more premium rootstocks that we might have previously been thinking about. So again, it comes back to that sort of, it has to be managed properly, but with incredibly sort of powerful tools. And now, more and more, over the decades, we've been managing soil moistures and really looking at, some of the other vine physiology sort of, measures. We're realizing just how different the different rootstocks can be.
And are you aware of any interaction between vine age and rootstock adaptation? I always think the rootstock's a bit like the drummer in the band, doesn't it? It kind of never gets the attention. But actually, there are some, of course, ungrafted, very old vineyards. But certainly, if we look to the old vineyards of the future, most of them will be on rootstock. Are you aware of any interaction between the age of the rootstock and any beneficial adaptation? Are there conversely, any problems that might arise perhaps with the older vines and the resilience of the graft union, for example? Is this an aspect that you've looked into?
Not with a sort of a replicated trials, but I can tell you that, in the Barossa, for example, we've got vines, or there are vines in the Barossa, back as far as, at least 1922, possibly earlier, but the records we have of vines grafted onto rootstocks from 1922. So there's vineyards over 100 years old now that are quite happily, part of our beautiful old vine resource. And so there's, it all comes down to, to vine health as well, and obviously management. But we don't see a significant difference between what's on rootstocks and what's on their own roots. And I would imagine, knowing the beauty of some rootstocks, that if you, again, some of the reasons they're so drought tolerant, some of our rootstocks, because they're very deep rooted, the roots go down a lot further than some other rootstocks that might be more shallow. So, I would imagine that, rootstocks, we'll get to 150 and 200 years on rootstocks, possibly even more better. That's not very good English. Much more healthier, and perhaps even, producing better grapes even than we're seeing now off our own vines. So, I probably didn't necessarily sum it up in that first question properly, but, I do think that rootstocks are, right rootstock in the right place is always going to be better. Or at least equivalent to, but potentially better than, a vine on its own roots, just because of the ability of us to really be able to manage our site. Yes. And as we go forward with climate change and the things we know and the things that we don't know, I can only see that becoming more and more important.
And yet, interestingly, I know that some of your nursery clients do request ungrafted vines. As you mentioned, you don't have phylloxera currently in South Australia. How does this decision impact the vine's resilience, and do you think they're crazy to ask for it?
Look, I don't think they're crazy. This world, the beauty about wine and the beauty about the fact that we all get together around, screens and together and do tastings like I've been involved in here in New York, it's because of the diversity of people's thinking and their stories and their way that they manage their vines. And I think you can never take away that very important part of terroir, which is the human element to it, and those decisions that people make. And if people, I think in South Australia, we're very, very lucky here that we've never had phylloxera, and a lot of other vine diseases, that other parts of the world have had, and we don't take that for granted. But there is always a risk of phylloxera coming in, despite the incredible sort of quarantine, that we have. I don't know how many, states around the world have their old vines or their vines, but including their old vines protected, under an act of parliament. And we do, and we have since 1874. The foresight of our South Australian government to put into an act of parliament, biosecurity and and laws about quarantine and about what you can and can't bring into the areas I think was incredible foresight. And so, but there's always a risk in the way that people move around the world these days and all that sort of stuff. So I can't imagine not planting on a rootstock that was phylloxera resistant, just in case. But that's other people's decisions. And if phylloxera doesn't come in, if they've got sites where they don't have issues with some of those other points that I mentioned, that you might need rootstocks for, then that's people's choice. But I think even if you're just looking at it from a purely commercial decision, that in most situations rootstocks are probably going to give you a better commercial outcome, as well as an equal, if not better, quality outcome.
Thank you. On terroir and the interaction of terroir and climate change, you've previously mentioned that terroir and climate change must be considered hand in hand, which I think that's a really important point, because quite a lot of the press coverage, that's spoken about climate change, is almost that like climate change is completely rewriting what we think of as terroir. But you believe that terroir's influence remains very powerful and significant as long as there is access to water. Could you tell us a bit more about this idea and how Yalumba is balancing these two factors in your vineyard practices?
Sure. And this is I think it's a really fascinating sort of question. And I think one of the advantages, if you can put it that way, that we have, particularly in South Australia, because we're such a dry, grape growing country, and we're so used to droughts, and we're also so used to heat waves and fluctuations between our seasons. That we know that if we have a season, which we have had more than once over the last decades, where we have our average temperatures considerably higher, our yearly average temperature considerably higher than our sort of normal sort of average temperature. And we see temperatures that people that you would read and going, oh well, when the Barossa gets to this temperature, average temperature, the wines are going to look like they come from the Riverland, for example, which is a much warmer region. And what we see, inevitably in those years is that is absolutely not the case. The wines are from the Barossa. They look like Barossa wines, whether it's a cooler season or whether it's a hotter season. And to me, that says that there's something much more inherently important, for grapevines than just temperature. And as you rightly point out, vines do need some water. I mean, they don't need, they're incredibly, tolerant of dryness, but they do need some water. So as long as we've got that as a resource, and climate change is affecting our, the water, of course, and we don't really know how that's going to go in terms of natural rainfall. But I think we are, so I'm not as worried about temperature as I am about water. I'm really worried about it for my own personal, well-being and all of those things. Don't get me wrong, but I think vines are, we've got to be careful we don't sort of overlay our own sort of feelings about temperature, over vines. Understanding, and particularly the older vines, how much of their biomass is under the ground compared to what's on the surface, right? So I think, and then there's a whole lot of other things that you can do, again through a lot of decades of research that's been done in Australia. Both proper research, by the scientists and the wine institutes, and then also just practices that we've evolved in vineyards. And there's a lot of things now that we do in vineyards, and we're using a lot more regenerative agriculture You'll see a lot more, if you come to the Barossa 40 years ago, you'd have seen a lot of ploughed and bare soil. And now, I drive around with people, and you've actually got to get out and sort of scratch away the grasses and say, see here, this soil's red, as opposed to the soil we were in last time, whereas you used to be able to do it all from just driving around the roads. So that's, more cover crops, more permanent grasses, more mulching that's stopping heat reflecting into vines, different types of trellising. Where one of the practices that's becoming more and more common now, leading into heat waves, are things like the using of the kale and clay sort of sunscreen, which is an incredible thing. We've done some, a lot of trials on that because we were a bit skeptical in the early days, and we've found that, it significantly reduces tissue burn in heat waves. It doesn't stop the ripening of the grapes, but in fact, given that you've got healthier tissue, in your leaves, they actually ripen, they ripen better with better analysis, and they ripen more quickly than the vines that have had to sort of, suffer through the heat. So lots of different techniques that we're sort of learning that mitigate against just temperature. So yes, I'm a really strong believer in terroir, and I believe that there's lots and lots of impact, and the human impact into that, once again, in terms of that sort of adaptation and mitigation, is really important.
So while we mustn't sort of understate the importance and the critical nature of climate change, actually, when it comes to viticulture, these considerations have really driven research and adaptations in viticulture, which have had a much more holistic and sensitive awareness to the place of viticulture in our biome. And it's driving actually an inherently more regenerative and forward-looking approach, because all of the approaches to climate change force us to really think about where the viticulture sits in a much bigger context. And actually the challenge of it, the challenge of that, certainly for viticulture, is resulting in, if you like, the human factor in terroir really being activated. It's almost like there's this sudden new surge of really urgent scrutiny of what we think of as standard viticultural practice. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it is a really sort of fascinating sort of concept of how it all sort of sits. I often say to people when they come into our vineyards and things these days is that the only things that really aren't sort of part of our sort of the sort of the inherently native sort of situation that you're in are the grapevines. That sort of establishment of really conscious establishment of biodiversity within and around vineyards these days, I think, is an incredibly important part of that resilience to changes and to the way that we think about things. I think the more that we understand our impacts and what's going on at that sort of plant and terroir level, then the less sometimes the less we actually have to do, and the more confidence we can have that nature might sort of help that sort of balance.
Yes. On that leads me to ask you about the Yalumba's tricentenary vineyard. So you have this very ancient vineyard, which is dry farmed. Presumably it was planted as a dry farmed vineyard. Is that correct? Yes. But yet you told me that you do sort of hold in reserve the possibility for irrigation. Could you share your approach to dry farming in this vineyard, and under what conditions you might decide to implement irrigation?
Sure. So, a lot of the old vine, what are now old vine vineyards, were established, without, without irrigation, being sort of set up on them. I'm pretty sure, though, back in 1889, when our tricentenary vineyard was planted, that when those vines were babies, they would have been going out with buckets and watering them. I don't know that from sure, but I can't imagine they wouldn't have been. And I think it's lovely to sort of say we have dry farm vineyards that we don't irrigate, but you've got to be careful that you don't what do we say? Cut your nose off to spite your face. If we have a really, really long dry period, and a little bit of irrigation is going to help those vines ripen a better crop and a better quality of grapes, and to help the vines stay healthy, then we would absolutely irrigate them. Under all of the situations that I mentioned before, measuring the soil moisture, it's not just a case of just sort of pouring water on, but the best, you want to get the best wine out of it, at the end of it, and you don't want to compromise that. So if we had a really, really extended heat wave, then yeah, we probably would put some water on it. No, I've lost my train of thought. I was going in a different direction with that, but that's okay.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's almost a bit of an accepted trope in the wine conversation that irrigating is somehow cheating. That you're not playing the game of this kind of mystical dance of getting your vine on a knife edge when it really shows you what it can do, and then there's this rather poetic struggle that occurs where the most beautiful wine comes out. But it seems really there are parallels really also with the rootstock consideration, because there's another idea, isn't there, that there's a sort of a purity, a poetic purity to the ungrafted, dry farmed vine. But as you say, probably management practices of the past, they would have adapted because they didn't want these things to die. So do you think that there's a kind of a need for a different conversation around the role of irrigation and a more nuanced conversation, especially when it comes to, well, preserving today's old vines and then growing the old vines of the future?
I think it's vital, and I think I mentioned, right back in the beginning, that the stories that we talk about, and I mean the real stories that we talk about when we're talking about our wines to people, and particularly the great wines of the world, they are incredibly important. But everybody has a different story, and every vineyard is different. And over the years, a lot of people sort of surprised with how many of our vineyards in Australia, and particularly where we are in the Barossa, are irrigated. But what I say to people is, if you actually have no natural rainfall that falls in between in your summer months and early, which is not unusual for us, and into early autumn, then those vines are going to need some water. And they're plants. They're not going to. You're not going to have a prime athlete and say, okay, well, you can't eat or drink because we want you to be skinny. It's all about looking at everything in a holistic sort of viewpoint. And for us, irrigation is an important part of most of our vineyards. It grows healthier vines. Those vines are going to live for longer, and the wines are going to taste better. And I think that's a really important thing. So while our stories are great, they have to be right for us. And we have so many other amazing things to talk about that I don't think we don't all need to have the same stories. We don't all need to have the same practices. And in fact, if we did, we wouldn't have as much beautiful diversity of wine around the world as we do. So you just have to be doing what you're doing. But what I'd say is don't try and put your own lens and wrap it up, put it over another region or another country, which is what I think is important for us as well. We see the same sort of things about the conversations around the world about when you're making wine, and whether it's chaptalized or whether it's acid addition is allowed, those sort of things. I mean, it's about what you have in the glass. It's the beauty of what you have in the glass, and is it delicious? Is it balanced? Is it sustainable? Are we going to continue to be able to make these styles and evolve these styles that are relevant for future? And is there going to be a place for us in the future?
Yes. On that, I'd like to ask you about your role as head of sustainability, which I understand you took on nearly 1 year ago. And this was a role that, well, basically you sort of created, isn't it? It was a role that you created, and that you were the first incumbent in. So as the head of sustainability at Yalumba, what are some of the key initiatives that you're working on? And do you having this role, which is very focused on this sustainability piece, is among forward-thinking wineries in Australia? Are you seeing more of this kind of centering of sustainability with very senior people leading in those roles?
Sorry, I got muted somehow. Yeah, look, I think most of the larger wineries now are having people within these roles. I don't want it to sound like we haven't had a sustainability sort of program prior to a year ago, because that's absolutely not the case. We have we're celebrating this year for the Hillsmith family of Yalumba are celebrating 175 years of family winemaking, which is incredible. And if you think about that, you don't get to 175 years and 6 generations of a family business without having something really inherently sustainable about it. Mm. And of course, sustainability is much more than our environmental thing and the social the social sustainability, but also, just being a profitable business is a really important part of sustainability. But and so we've got a lot of people right across our business, working in this area. So I'm definitely not creating something from scratch, but it is becoming more and more important. There's a lot more sort of certifications that are becoming important. There's a lot of mandatory reporting coming into Australia, which I think is already happening in Europe in terms of carbon emissions. So it's more and more, it needs a really active focus, not just sort of being part of everybody's, it still is part of everybody's job and everybody's thinking, but you still, I think that having somebody to help coordinate that is important. A lot of it's actually about storytelling. It's about having a face that will actually tell people, particularly our customers, the people that are drinking our wines, those sort of stories, and bringing those with that sustainability lens, which is not that different from our normal storytelling lens, as well. But actively, the things that we're really involved in now, we're certified members of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, which is Australia's national viticulture and wine sustainability program. It's like I think you had the Lodi guys on yesterday, and it's a similar program, I think, to what they've got there. It's all about continuous improvement, about benchmarking, about what is best practice today, what is best practice tomorrow, and understanding that this whole journey is a journey where we're learning more and more, and you need to sometimes you almost feel like you're going around in a circle, and then the next best practice thing might come out of it. So it's that beautiful journey that we're going on as a business, but also the community of the Australian viticulture and wine sector that's going on that together, and helping bring along other businesses into that. We're also members of the International Wineries for Climate Action, which is a focused organisation on decarbonisation, aligned with the United Nations Race to Zero campaign. And through that, we're measuring our carbon emissions right across scopes 1 to 3. With all of the help of the calculators and the combined knowledge of those, now nearly 50 wine businesses, which cover, I think, about 150 wineries in 12 countries, which is incredible. And I'm sure there's people from many of those companies that will be listening to this. But it was, for those who don't, it's an organisation that was started by the Jackson family and the Torres family in 2019. And it is all about working together to decarbonise wine, and it's an amazing organisation to be part of. So that's exciting. And we our 2024 numbers are still being audited, but we think we've, through our own initiatives, of course, but working with the International Wineries for Climate Action, we're not just shy of 40% reduction from our baseline year, which is which we're excited about. We're excited about the journey. I think every percent now gets harder and harder. The low hanging fruit, as you say, has happened, but but you don't lose hope when you're sort of working with such great people.
Yes.
So there's some of the things, and the other things that we're ongoing, really extensive work within, actively encouraging biodiversity into our vineyards, because we know that the more of a natural balance you can get in your vineyards with all of the critters that you can see or that you can't see, or that they help the resilience of vines as well. If vines can look after themselves, and nature balances them rather than having to go in with a whole lot of chemicals. Then they are just going to be more resilient, and you're going to have much healthier and I would imagine much older vineyards into the future.
Yeah, fantastic. And congratulations on that 40% reduction. I mean, that's significant. That's really significant. And Jackson family, I should just give them a shout out. And they've been great supporters of the Old Vine Conference. Jackson Family Wines, they allowed us to set up the Old Vine Registry. So yeah, great to see so many leading wineries working together. You mentioned this is the 175th year of anniversary for Yalumba. And of course, Brian Walsh of Yalumba was really instrumental in creating what became the Barossa Old Vine Charter, which was one of the earliest sort of codes and voluntary registering of old vineyards. How do you sort of see this charter? What do you think the role of the Old Vine Charter in Barossa has been for the attention and kind of value placed on the old vine heritage of the Barossa?
Look, I think it's been really important. It's got people round the table talking about old vines, and I was thinking about this actually last night, and it is only in relatively recent times, in that 175 years, that we, and I think people potentially around the world, but certainly in the Barossa, have really been thinking about old vines and how important they were. For a long time, I think people just took them for granted. So in 2007, as you say, we at Yalumba established the Old Vine Charter, and it was Brian Walsh's sort of brainchild, working really closely with Robert Hill Smith at the time. As we were understanding the importance of these old vines, as we were really understanding how what beautiful wines they made, and realizing that we needed to protect them, this sort of charter sort of came about. And it was also about making sure that even though it's only ever been a voluntary code, it is there to sort of give some sort of structure around what people can call old vines and not old vines. And so it was there was a lot of thought go into it. How old is old, and I know different people have different ideas about that. We all did as well. But that sort of 35 years, seemed like a sort of ultimately a really good number to settle on. For old vine, but then of course those different steps, because of the fact that we've got vines that are 70-year-old and 100-year-old, and over 125 years old. I mean, there's some incredible vines now, and so that charter of sort of talking about the breadth of old vines and the levels has just been really important, and it also helps us to sort of think about it then. So I think more people became more proud of their old vines, so it was sort of it became a sort of a self-fulfilling sort of prophecy, if you like, and that was why it was so wonderful when the Barossa took it over, to really have a something to celebrate. And I think we're used to being sort of talked about as New World and the new kids on the block down there in Australia, and yet with some of the oldest vines in the world, it's quite an incredible place to be.
Yes, fantastic, thank you. And my last question. The future of viticulture at Yalumba, given all the ongoing research that we've talked about into drought tolerance, clean clones, climate adaptation, what do you see as the biggest challenge for the next generation of Australian viticulturists?
I think the biggest challenge is actually going to make sure that there is a place for viticulture and wine, in the future. And that's one of the reasons why we're working so hard on sustainability and all of those sort of programs around it, because it's not just about making sure we know how to grow the grapes into a changing future, but that we actually have that social license to do that. This sort of magic year of 2050 that we're all working towards, with net zero and all of those things, there's going to be another 1.7 billion people on the planet that need to eat. And not only that, but a lot of the areas that are growing food, crops that are not as resilient perhaps as grapevines, are going to be affected by a changing climate as well. So, the assumption that the land that we use now to farm and to grow our vineyards, even the really old vineyards, to assume that we're going to have the right, to make a luxury product like wine that ultimately the human race doesn't need. I don't think we can take that for granted. I'd love to think we could take it for granted. I don't know how. I think wine, not having wine in a lovely society would be a shame. But we don't want to be growing grapes and making wine, making a luxury product at the expense of people being able to eat. So our resources, which are ultimately the soils and water, we're going to need to make sure that there's a place for us. And how do we do that? How do we become more clever about irrigation? How do we become more clever about farming? We need to lead perhaps other industries as well down that path. And we also need to, really make sure that we're keeping our research and those sort of long-term sort of trials going, both, at individual businesses, at regional levels, but also, with the amazing sort of research institutes and universities that we have around the world. They're going to be more and more and more vital to the sustainability and the long-term future of our vineyards.
Thank you. Louisa, thank you so much. We've actually come to the end of our session. It has whizzed by. I apologize. There is a detailed question on the use of clay-vor canopy protection from Claire, which I don't think we can get to, but if it's okay, Claire, we'll follow up with you after that, because it's more of a detailed
yeah, absolutely. And Sarah, I'm really happy to take if anybody does want to follow up directly with anything, whether it's the IWCA or the Kale and Clays or whatever. I'm always happy to chat or to email or whatever.
Thank you, Louisa. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say just how fortunate I think the industry is to have your talent and also your approach, this very sort of coherent, integrated, sort of really 360 approach. So thank you. And I should say, when I did some posts saying that I would be speaking to you, I had so many messages from my friends in the wine industry saying, "Oh, we love Yalumba, this is great." So thank you. And as I say, we will be sharing the presentation afterwards.